back. It's 6 months since the war in Ukraine started. The war has killed thousands, displaced millions. Several cities in Ukraine's eastern side especially were reduced to rubble. The nuclear sites like Zaporizhzhia are under threat as well. However, Russia, on the other hand, is under severe sanctions of the West since President Putin decided to wage a war against Ukraine. However, the jury is still out on whether the sanctions have piled enough pressure on Putin to back off anytime soon. Amidst all this, the Russian state pollsters suggest that Putin's approval ratings within Russia remain above 80%. Is this popularity or propaganda? That's our discussion this evening. Joining me on the show is Fred Weir, Russian affairs expert and Russia correspondent for Boston-based Daily, the Christian Science Monitor. Professor Anuradha Shenoy, she's associated with the Jindal Global University, and Commodore Uday Bhaskar, a security and defense analyst, director, Society for Policy Studies. Fred, coming first to you, what's the credibility, first of all, of these polls that are conducted within Russia and the general sense that you get on the approval of President Putin despite the war?
I think that the polls are broadly accurate. They don't measure the level of enthusiasm. And I think that support for Putin and the war is fairly tepid. My own reality check in the surroundings where I am here in Moscow is that people are largely apolitical. The war has not come home. Sanctions may be impacting Russia's economy in the long term. There may be serious deficits coming down the track. But right now, in everyday life, in the supermarkets, in the consumer services in general, it's almost impossible to see any impact. I know people in the West just hate to hear me say that, but I'm just the messenger. I do not see ordinary Russians being impacted as yet by these sanctions. And therefore, it's not a factor. And even if it were, I think it's counterintuitive and certainly contrary to everything we know about Russian history to suppose that a little bit of deprivation would turn Russians against their leaders. Russians have a long experience with taking punishment and carrying on. So in general, I don't think that there's great enthusiasm for the war. Putin is seen as the steward of Russia, and there doesn't appear to be any alternative to him, to most people. But so far, that is the state of play here.
Okay. Professor Shenoy, what, according to you, explains this sort of approval rating for the president?
One, the Russians believe in their state. The other argument is they do believe that if there were missiles and if Ukraine joined NATO, that would be an existential threat on Russia. For years, they've had this kind of coming into their press that if Ukraine becomes part of NATO and if they lose Crimea, then they're isolated, they're under threat, and next it would be them. So it's like if, for example, if we had nuclear missiles on any of our borders, or if the US had nuclear missiles on Canada or Mexico, the people would rally together. So I think Fred Weir is right. The Russians are very used to the state extracting from them. There's a Russian nationalism. And right now there's also a Ukrainian nationalism. The other thing is that also that Russian ethnic minorities were getting killed in that 7-year civil war which preceded this. And that also got through to them. And there was some kind of solidarity with ethnic Russians who had suddenly found themselves in a new state of Ukraine.
All right. Commodore Bhaskar, does this then mean that there is no real incentive, or would I say even something, if we use a negative term for that, there is no real pressure on President Putin to back off from this war?
I think that would be a fair assessment, Maha, that if you look at these poll readings, and to add to what my fellow panelists have said, clearly there is no domestic compulsion there is no domestic political compulsion for President Putin, I think, to make any radical change as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned. I just want to add one more element, if I may, which is to buttress the same point, that for the larger population in Russia, which has been tracking this war now for 6 months plus, literally to the day, I think there is also this element of the United States. Because if you look at recent Russian history, particularly, I would say, from the Cold War to the post-Cold War, and the way in which they felt that the United States had, in a way, double-crossed Moscow. This is all part of the narrative within Russia. I think they also feel that the war in Ukraine is really a kind of proxy in which the United States and the Western alliance is trying to, quote unquote, create this insecurity and add to the pressure points as far as Russia's core security interests are concerned. And I think that's a very strong element which is reflected in the kind of support that President Putin is getting in the polls.
All right. Well, I'm afraid we have the last 1 minute left, so I'll give that to Fred Weir. Fred, does this mean that President Putin becomes an even larger than life figure now, despite and with the war in Ukraine?
He's always been this popular. I mean, it's had its ups and downs, but he's always been, for the last 20 years, the guy in Russia, and it seems like he's the indispensable man. But the war has put a lot of strains on Russia. As I say, the unprecedented level of sanctions must have some effect, even if it's not visible right now. I think a lot depends on how this war goes. If the battlefield reverses, the whole picture can change. But if the Russians continue to win, and they are slowly, apparently, grinding down the Ukrainians, I think that this will just make Putin stronger than ever.
All right. Many thanks to all three of you for joining us here on this quick discussion.